Assalamu alaikum. The focus of this session is going to be on the trends of balance of payments, particularly in terms of the developing countries all across the globe. And secondly, we are going to discuss that what are going to be the causes and the consequences of these deficits or whatever trends we experience in terms of balance of payments on the overall economic performance of a developing country. And then we are going to discuss the factors that led to the debt crisis which we experienced in 1980s. So that would be taken up as an example in order to illustrate that how the debt crisis take into place or they happen in the context of the developing countries, and what could be the factors that can help us in overcoming such debt crisis that happened in the 1980s, and we have all experienced that. So the first thing which I'm going to discuss is the trends of the balance of payments. So together we know that by now we know that what are the various components that help us in understanding the overall makeup of or the structure of the balance of payment. It is composed of the major two types of accounts, the capital and the current account. What are the various entries we take into account in the capital account and the current account. So the current account takes into account all the goods and services that cross the border, the market value of all the goods and services, plus whatever we spend on the services in order to export or import these goods. In addition to that, when we focused upon the capital account, we considered that it includes the various types of investments and the grants and the loans and the repayments of the loans and the interest which is paid on the loans or the debt servicing which is made on the loans. So when we are taking into account the capital movement across the border of a country, then we are talking about the capital account, that and together these two, current and capital account, make up the balance of payment. So when we look at the developing countries, we see that we have experienced different types of trends, but the important thing which we have observed, that if the country is considered to be economically very weak and it is whatever exports it is making, they are relatively insufficient and they are smaller as compared to the total amount of imports that are being made in these countries, then we observe that there is going to be a continuous deficit is there in terms of the balance of payments. So for the same illustration, as long as the overall trend is concerned in the context of a developing country, right now I'm going to show you a table which illustrates the data, the real life data from 1980 until 2009, and that covers the various regions in which most of the developing countries are concentrated. So that will help us in understanding the overall trends in the balance of payments, particularly in terms of the current account, to see that this is how the overall deficits or the surplus can be explained, or the performance, the economic performance of these various developing countries can be observed by looking at the current account balances for a longer time span, which spans from 1980 until 2009. So to begin with, we see that in this table you will be looking at the various data points that have been given corresponding to the various years, or सारे के सारे जो values हैं for every single year that have been given in terms of various regions, जिसमें सारे के सारे developing countries have been accounted for, and then those regions are accounted for जहाँ developing countries ज़्यादा concentration में पाए जाते हैं, जैसे Sub-Saharan Africa है. So we see that if we overall look at the economic scenario of all the regions, then Sub-Saharan Africa के अंदर के जितने भी मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक स्टेटिस्टिक्स हैं या डेवलपमेंट इकोनॉमिक्स के जो हम वेरिएबल्स लेते हैं जिसके ऊपर हम इकोनॉमिक परफॉर्मेंस ऑफ अ कंट्री को इवैल्यूएट करते हैं या डेवलपमेंट प्रोसेस की एक्टिविटी को हम अगर कंसिडर करें या इवैल्यूएट करें, तो वी सी दैट मोस्ट ऑफ द डेवलपमेंट इंडिकेटर्स पर की टर्म्स में बहुत बैडली जो रिप्रेजेंटेशन आता है, दैट इज ऑफ सब सहारन अफ्रीका, या इन अदर वर्ड्स वी कैन से दैट इन सब सहारन अफ्रीका Africa, as long as the overall development indicators are concerned, they show a very gloomy and sad picture. So वहाँ हमें ज़्यादा concentration में poverty देखने को मिलती है, ज़्यादा concentration में slow movement of economy देखने को मिलता है, वहाँ ज़्यादा concentration में हमें similarly when we look into in terms of look at sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the deficits in the balance of payment, we observe very large values of deficits as long as the current account deficits or the overall balance of payment deficits are concerned, that are highly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa. So if you will look at this, just skim through the different values which in the table which you are seeing right now on the screen, आपको देखने को मिल रहा है कि particularly when we begin with 1980, तो शुरू में आपको for all the developing economies deficit में value नहीं देखने को मिल रही है, आपको surplus में देखने को मिल रही है value for 1980, but as long as you move down, अगर आप all developing countries के नीचे जाएंगे, developing Asia, Middle East and North Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, developing Western Hemisphere की values को देखेंगे तो वहाँ आपको negative values देखने को मिलते हैं, which indicate that during 1980s they suffered or they experienced a severe deficit in the current account, which is pretty large. And as you move further, this deficit या crisis aggravates, is seen to be aggravated. जैसे जैसे आप onwards move करते हैं from 1980 to 1981, from 1981 to 1982, from 1982 onwards, तो this starts getting aggravated और ये काफी worsen होता हुआ देखने को मिलता है. But gradually the thing gets managed or the things improve when we look at the values for the year 2000. वहाँ sub-Saharan Africa और डेवलपिंग वेस्टर्न हेमिस्फीयर की वैल्यू के अलावा बाकी सारे के सारे वैल्यूज करंट अकाउंट के ऊपर आपको सरप्लस दिखा रहे हैं, वेयर एज सब सहारन अफ्रीका और जो डेवलपिंग वेस्टर्न हेमिस्फीयर है उन दोनों के वैल्यूज अगैन आपको डेफिसिट देखने को दिखा रहे हैं इन ईयर 2000 एज वेल. सो एंड द सेम थिंग कंटिन्यूज फॉर द रेस्ट ऑफ द डेटा पॉइंट्स. सो बेसिकली वी आर ट्राइंग टू सी दैट इफ वी लुक एट द ओवरऑल सिनारियो in terms of the balance of payment, particularly in the context of the current accounts, तो आप एक huge time span which starts from 1980 until 2009 में majority developing countries में एक बहुत severe, large, growing किस्म की deficit observe करते हैं, which indicates that the whatever loans that were given to these countries, to the developing nations, in order to overcome the problems that were being experienced by these countries at that time, they found it difficult to repay that amount of debt which was given to them. Plus, उन्होंने अपना जो production का potential है उसको enhance नहीं किया है, उसको इतना nicely बढ़ाया नहीं है, जिसकी वजह से आपको एक severe deficit देखने को मिल रही है throughout for a longer time span. Again, you can see that this indicates overall like lack of capacity of producing that level of output which is required or which is demanded by the people living in those countries, and as a consequence we see that their import bill turned out to be larger as compared to the total exports which they managed to earn, or the money which they managed to earn by exporting whatever stuff they were exporting. And as a consequence, as a result of that, जो हमारे पास current account की balance है starting from 1980 until 2009, उनमें मेजॉरिटी आप देखने को मिल रहा है आपको कि जो वैल्यूज हैं दे वर गिवन इन द प्रीवियस टेबल व्हिच वी वर डिस्कसिंग एज द नेगेटिव एंट्रीज, जो कि आपको सिवियर ग्रोइंग लार्ज डेफिसिट्स ऑन द करंट अकाउंट बैलेंस दिखा रहे थे. सो व्हेन वी लुक एट दिस overall amount of this current account, तो इसको satisfy करने के वास्ते we discussed that there are several ways, but as long as the developing countries are concerned, because उनका जो production का potential है वो बहुत low होता है, या उनके जो resources हैं वो fully utilize नहीं होते, उनकी जो man power है वो nicely अपने high level of potential के ऊपर काम नहीं कर रही होती, therefore they find it very hard to cope with this growing deficit in terms of the balance of payment. और उसको हटाने के लिए या उसको रिड्यूस करने के लिए the major source which they use in order to overcome this deficit in the balance of payment is that they borrow. और जब वो बोरो करते हैं फ्रॉम एक्सटर्नल सोर्सेज तो देन वी नो दैट देर आर दीज प्रॉब्लम्स ऑफ डेट सर्विसिंग ऑल्सो एंड अगैन इफ समबडी इज नॉट क्लियर विद द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ डेट सर्विसिंग का मतलब है कि आपने कोई भी मसाइल की वजह से अपने बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट में डेफिसिट की वजह से या आपने जो बजट का डेफिसिट है जो गवर्नमेंट बजट बनाती है हर साल उसमें अगर रेवेन्यूज आपके जो टोटल रेवेन्यू जो गवर्नमेंट ने जनरेट किए हैं दे फॉल शॉर्ट ऑफ द टोटल एक्सपेंडिचर्स विच द गवर्नमेंट हैज इनकर्ड ड्यूरिंग अ ईयर, अगर उसमें आपको डेफिसिट देखने को मिले तो दैट इज कॉल्ड द बजट डेफिसिट. सो बजट डेफिसिट को या बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट की डेफिसिट को ओवरकम करने के लिए गवर्नमेंट्स बोरो फ्रॉम द एक्सटर्नल सोर्सेज, फ्रॉम द इंटरनल सोर्सेज, and when they are borrowing money from the external sources so या internal sources तो फिर आपने जब लोन लिया है तो आपने उसको वापस करना होता है. सो अगर हम रीपेमेंट ऑफ द प्रिंसिपल अमाउंट विच यू हैव बोरोड और साथ ही में इंटरेस्ट को पे करते हैं तो दैट टाइप ऑफ पेमेंट इज कॉल्ड डेट सर्विसिंग. सो वी सॉ दैट जब हम डेफिसिट आई बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट के अंदर उस डेफिसिट को ओवरकम करने के लिए या उस डेफिसिट को बैलेंस करने के लिए आप एक्सटर्नल कंट्रीज, डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज जो है वो एक्सटर्नल सोर्सेज से बोरो करती हैं और जब उन्होंने बोरो किया तो डेफिनेटली इन द सबसीक्वेंट ईयर्स, इन द लेटर ईयर दे हैव टू पे इट बैक. सो डेट सर्विसिंग करने से भी जो आपकी जो डेफिसिट्स हैं इन द सबसीक्वेंट ईयर्स बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट के अंदर जो डेफिसिट है उसकी अमाउंट जो है या गैप जो है वो ग्रो करना शुरू कर देता है because of debt servicing कि आप then you start owing larger quantities of money in the form of debt servicing और उसकी वजह से आपका जो outflow है cash outflow that becomes larger as compared to the receipts which you have made or the foreign cash inflow. Therefore the gap or the deficit starts growing. So if it grows कंटिन्यूसली तो फिर आपके जो काफ़ी सारे प्रॉब्लम्स आपको फेस करने को मिलते हैं इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ अ डेवलपिंग कंट्री. और इस पर्टिकुलर चीज़ को अगर ये परपेचुएट कर जाए और पूरे के पूरे वर्ल्ड में ज़्यादातर डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज अगर इस किस्म के मसाइल का सामना कर रही हों तो हम ऐसे सिचुएशन को डेट क्राइसिस बोलते हैं. सो डेट क्राइसिस को समझने के लिए अगैन मैंने जैसे पहले बोला आई विल बी यूजिंग द एग्जांपल ऑफ द डेट क्राइसिस दैट हैपेंड इन 1980s. बट बिफोर दैट देयर इज दिस टर्म ऑफ बेसिक ट्रांसफर विच इज इम्पॉर्टेंट टू बी अंडरस्टूड प्रॉपर्ली. सो जब बेसिक ट्रांसफर को समझने के लिए मैं एक्सप्लेन करने जा रही हूँ एक छोटी सी इक्वेशन. सो उसमें हम एक चीज़ को काउंट फॉर करते हैं एंड दैट इज नोन एज द नेट कैपिटल इनफ्लो. सो नेट कैपिटल इनफ्लो इज given as a capital F और साथ में एक सबस्क्रिप्ट लगाई गई है कैपिटल N की. तो जो आपका नेट कैपिटल इनफ्लो है दैट इज गिवन एज स्मॉल d मल्टीप्लाइड बाय कैपिटल D वेयर कैपिटल D इज द टोटल डेट, स्मॉल d इज द परसेंटेज इंक्रीज इन द टोटल डेट. सो हर साल हमने कहा कि किसी भी डेवलपिंग कंट्री के अंदर जो टोटल डेट है उसकी हम अमाउंट लेंगे एज कैपिटल D. सो उसमें हर साल एक किसी प्रोपोर्शन से या किसी रेट के साथ उस कैपिटल डी के अंदर इजाफा हो रहा है. अगर हम एक डेवलपिंग कंट्री की बात कर रहे हैं तो वो जो टोटल इंक्रीज है या नेट कैपिटल इनफ्लो है दैट विल बी गिवन एज दिस स्मॉल डी विच इज द परसेंट इंक्रीज इन द टोटल डेट मल्टीप्लाइड बाय द टोटल अमाउंट ऑफ डेट विच इज कैपिटल डी. सो दिस स्मॉल डी मल्टीप्लाइड बाय कैपिटल डी विल गिव यू द नेट कैपिटल इनफ्लो. ये तो आपको पैसे मिल रहे हैं लेकिन इसके एक साथ ही में एक आउटफ्लो जा रहा है and that outflow will be accounted for by considering the interest rate which you have to pay on this total debt जो कि capital D से हम represent कर रहे हैं. So capital D को अगर हम interest rate के सामने multiply करें तो वो amount of money होगी जो outflow कर रही है. यानी कि अब आपने पैसे borrow किए कैपिटल डी और उसके ऊपर आपने सूद पे करना है. जो भी एक्सटर्नल सोर्सेज से आपने डेट सर्विसिंग के लिए के फॉर्म में पैसे दे रहे हैं या आपने जो डेफिसिट को सेटिस्फाई करने के लिए बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट के अंदर डेफिसिट थी उसको ओवरकम करने के वास्ते आपने पैसे बोरो किए. तो जो मनी आप पे कर रहे हैं that will be given by small r which is the interest rate multiplied by the total amount of debt which you have taken. So small r multiplied by capital D is the total net cash outflow. अभी मैंने आपको बोला the net cash inflow will be FN और उसकी वैल्यू हमने लगाई small d multiplied by capital D. So ये जो चीज़ है small d multiplied by capital D minus small r multiplied by capital D, this is गिविंग यू द बेसिक ट्रांसफर, यानी कि जो आपका नेट कैश इनफ्लो है माइनस कैश आउटफ्लो। डेट को अगर हम सिर्फ अकाउंट फॉर करें तो ये जो अमाउंट आप को मिलेगी, दैट बाय टेकिंग द डिफरेंस बिटवीन आर एंड डी मल्टीप्लाइड बाय एंड द डी स्मॉल डी मल्टीप्लाइड बाय कैपिटल डी, इसकी जो डिफरेंस है दैट वुड बी नोन एज द बेसिक ट्रांसफर। सो अगर जो इंक्रीमेंट आपकी लोन में आ रही है, small d multiplied by the total debt which you have. If the first term is larger then the latter term, जो second term आ रही है जो कि interest outflow की वजह से आप मनी को वापस पे बैक करने के वास्ते या डेट सर्विसिंग के वास्ते आप पैसे पे कर रहे हैं, इफ दैट पेमेंट इज स्मॉलर देन द अमाउंट विच यू आर हैविंग इन द फॉर्म ऑफ लोन, एडिशनल आपको कोई लोन मिल रही है, वो वैल्यू आपकी लार्ज है और जो आप रीपे कर रहे हैं दैट वैल्यू इज स्मॉलर, तो आपका जो बेसिक ट्रांसफर है उसकी वैल्यू होगी पॉजिटिव में और जो नेट आप निकालेंगे। सो अगर पॉजिटिव वैल्यू है तो दैट मीन्स इट इज गुड फॉर यू, दैट यू आर हैविंग मोर मनी, यू आर हैविंग मोर मनी बट यू आर पेइंग लेस, या आउटफ्लो आपका स्मॉलर है। ऑन द अदर हैंड समटाइम्स जब आप बोरो करते चले गए और आपकी जो लोन की वैल्यू थी वो क्यूमुलेट होती चली गई और नेचुरली जब आपने रीपे किया था आपने तब रीपे नहीं कर सके, आपके ऊपर पेनल्टीज लग गए, आपके ऊपर जो कंडीशनैलिटीज लगाए आईएमएफ ने या कुछ भी, जैसे पाकिस्तान के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में हमने ऑफ एंड ऑन वी एक्सपीरियंस दीज काइंड ऑफ थिंग्स, तो उससे क्या होता है कि आपका जो इंटरेस्ट रेट है, ये जो कंडीशनैलिटीज हैं या कंडीशंस आपके ऊपर लगते हैं, कर्जा लिया वापस नहीं किया, तो वो स्ट्रॉन्ग होता चला जाता है, स्ट्रिंजेंट होता चला जाता है, आपके ऊपर आर जो है रेट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट दैट बिकम्स लार्जर। सो इस वजह से जब अमाउंट बढ़ती चली गई, एक्यूमुलेट हो गया, डेट आपके पास ज्यादा, इंटरेस्ट बढ़ना शुरू हो गया, तो ऐसे के कॉन्सिक्वेंस में, ऐसे के सिचुएशन में लेटर स्टेजेस पे जाके डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज की जो आउटफ्लो हो जाती है, रीपेमेंट ऑन द लोन या डेट सर्विसिंग, दैट बिकम्स लार्जर एज कंपेयर टू द अमाउंट विच दे आर गेटिंग, यानी कि नेट इनफ्लो बिकम्स शॉर्ट ऑफ द नेट आउटफ्लो ऑन डेट्स, या डेट सर्विसिंग की जो अमाउंट है वो लार्ज हो जाती है, जिसकी वजह से जो आपका बेसिक ट्रांसफर है उसकी वैल्यू नेगेटिव हो जाती है। सो अगर हम कंटिन्यूअसली इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ अ डेवलपिंग कंट्री देखें कि जो आपका जो बेसिक ट्रांसफर की अमाउंट है वो मुसलसल नेगेटिव चलती चली जा रही है, तो वो आपकी जो बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट की डेफिसिट है उसको फर्दर एग्रोवेट करने के लिए, फर्दर उसकी वैल्यू को इंटेंसिफाई करने के लिए, डेफिसिट को, उसमें वो कंट्रीब्यूट करता है। और अगर इफ दिस कंटिन्यूज टू बिहेव इन द सेम वे, तो देन देयर कुड बी ह्यूज प्रॉब्लम्स फॉर दैट कंट्री जहां इस तरह की डेफिसिट अकर की थी और उस डेफिसिट को ओवरकम करने के वास्ते लोन लिया गया था। और आपको ये बहुत ज़्यादा अच्छी तरह से समझ में आ सकता है क्योंकि while being the residents of Pakistan, we have been experiencing the same. हमने देखा कि हमारे कंट्री के अंदर बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट में डेफिसिट था, हमारा जो एक्सपोर्ट्स का पोटेंशियल है that is there, but जो whatever actually we export is fairly smaller as compared to whatever imports we have every year, और उसमें हमारा जो क्रूड ऑयल है और जो अदर इस तरह के चीज़ें हैं जो हम घर में नेशनल लेवल के ऊपर, लोकली डोमेस्टिक लेवल के ऊपर प्रोड्यूस नहीं करते, हम मशीनरी को, इक्विपमेंट को, ऑयल को, इस तरह के और बहुत सारे चीज़ों को हैवी क्वांटिटी में, लार्ज क्वांटिटीज़ में इंपोर्ट करते हैं, जिसकी वजह से हमारे एक्सपोर्ट्स जो हैं वो हमारा इंपोर्ट बिल एक्सपोर्ट से कई गुना ज़्यादा सुपरसीड कर जाता है। और उस डेफिसिट को सेटिस्फाई करने के वास्ते प्लस वेरियस डेवलपमेंटल एक्सपेंडिचर्स को दिखाने के लिए हमें बोरो करनी पड़ती है अमाउंट बाहर एक्सटर्नल सोर्सेज से, और चूंकि हम वी फेल टू रीपे ऑन द गिवन डेट्स एंड वी फेल टू फॉलो द शेड्यूल दैट वाज गिवन टू अस इन ऑर्डर टू रीपे दोज अमाउंट्स, देयरफॉर जो हमारे ऊपर कंडीशनैलिटीज लगे हुए हैं आईएमएफ के और जो इंटरेस्ट रेट हमारे ऊपर लग चुकी है, जो स्ट्रिंजेंट पॉलिसीज की वजह से हमारा जो अमाउंट विच इज़ पेड एज द इंस्टॉलमेंट, अक्सर आपने देखा होगा कि जब पाकिस्तान की गवर्नमेंट जो है वो किस्त पे करती है कर्जे की आईएमएफ को, तो हमारा जो बेचारी करेंसी है पाकिस्तानी, उसकी वैल्यू काफ़ी शेक हो जाती है। सो दैट इज़ ऑल दीज थिंग्स आर एसोसिएटेड विद this particular concept of balance of payment and the deficits that are there with the balance of payment. So इसी चीज़ को मज़ीद वजाहत करने के लिए the thing which I am going to illustrate now is the origins and the causes and the consequences of the huge debt crisis which the developing countries experienced during 1980s. So firstly we are going to discuss that what caused that debt crisis, and then we are going to discuss that how people the countries managed to overcome this debt crisis that happened in 1980s. So originally we saw that there was a huge increase in the prices of the oil in the beginning of 1980s. Plus हमने देखा कि because of this increase in the industrialization that took place in the developing countries in the early 1980s की वजह से जो हमारे import थे of the industrial setups of the various types of plants, manufacturing items, ये सब चीजें जो हैं because industrialization was taking place in various parts in the developing countries, that exceeded considerably. Plus अभी मैंने डिस्कस किया ऑयल के प्राइसेस काफ़ी ऊपर चले गए 1980s के अंदर. फिर एक और इम्पॉर्टेंट चीज़ थी कि जब आप इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन की प्रोसेस व्हेन वाज टेकिंग प्लेस इंपोर्ट्स बढ़े तो जो बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट के अंदर डेफिसिट एक्सपीरियंस की गई, उस डेफिसिट को ओवरकम करने के लिए या जो डेवलपमेंटल प्रोजेक्ट्स के ऊपर काम करने के वास्ते एक्सटेंसिव लोन्स लिए गए फ्रॉम द एक्सटर्नल सोर्सेज एज लॉन्ग एज द डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज आर कंसर्न. सो फिर हमने देखा कि बिकॉज इंडस्ट्रियलाइजेशन की प्रोसेस जो है वो इनिशियल फेज के अंदर थी इन कंट्रीज में, तो हमारे जो उस जमाने के अंदर जो एक्सपोर्ट्स थे इन कंट्रीज के, दे वर फेयरली शॉर्ट ऑफ द टोटल इंपोर्ट्स को अगर हम कंपेयर करें, बिकॉज आप मशीनरी को, इक्विपमेंट को, इंडस्ट्रियल यूनिट्स को, टेक्नोलॉजी को इंपोर्ट कर रहे हैं एंड यू आर पेइंग अ लॉट ऑफ मनी फॉर दैट, और साथ ही में आपने जो रॉ फ्यूल बाय करे हैं इंटरनेशनल मार्केट से उसके प्राइसेस रिलेटिवली हाई थे, तो जिसकी वजह से आपके जो बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट के हालात हैं वो काफ़ी ख़राब हो गए, काफ़ी सुवेयर चले गए. जो डेफिसिट की अमाउंट थी दैट टर्न आउट टू बी अ बिट हायर, एंड दैट काइंड ऑफ इनिशिएटेड दिस डेट crisis that the world experienced in 1980s. So another argument which is followed in order to explain as the cause or the reason behind this crisis that was experienced in 1980 all across the globe was, and particularly जो developing countries हैं इनमें debt crisis के form में जो experience की गई, उसके पीछे several experts believe that there were these mechanics of the petrodollar recycling process that took place at that time. So you must be interested in knowing what is meant by the petrodollar recycling. So petrodollar का मतलब है वो dollars जो कि पेट्रोलियम की मुख्तलिफ products को बेचने से generate किए जाएं, कमाए जाएं, that type of dollars which are earned by like selling the petroleum products or petrol to the outside world, to USA, Europe in particular, the United States of America. So whatever money you have generated by selling oil or petroleum products to these developed nations are called the petrodollars. So what happened at this time was that it has been identified that there was this petrodollar recycling that took place in this time period, and the people who came up with this concept of petrocycle recycling, they came up with this model which I'm going to discuss with you in the form of the figure which you are seeing right now. So यहाँ इस figure के अंदर आपको mechanics of petrodollar recycling explain किए गए हैं. So आपको देखने को मिल रहा है on your left there is this little block which has been labeled as OPEC countries export oil. So हमने देखा कि जो OPEC के countries हैं, oil producing countries, they were selling oil to the Europe, Japan and the United States. So in return of this oil, they were getting dollars. So जब उनके पास इतनी एक्सटेंसिव हाई लेवल ऑफ डॉलर आ गई, और अभी मैंने बोला इन 1980 जिस तरह से 1973 में एकदम ऑयल प्राइसेस वर इंक्रीज, सिमिलरली इन द बिगिनिंग ऑफ 1980s द ऑयल प्राइसेस वर इंक्रीज कंसिडरेबली. सो by selling this huge amount of oil to these developed nations such as US, Japan and European countries, the OPEC countries managed to generate a lot of dollars, and what they did with those dollars was that they were putting these dollars in the American and European banks. So अगर आप इसी टेबल के अंदर OPEC country वाले ब्लॉक के नीचे वाले ब्लॉक को देखेंगे तो this has been labeled as the OPEC countries were making up so much money in the form of dollars, and they were putting their surplus amount of money or profits in the European and US banks. So when these banks were having sufficient extra amount of dollars, what they did was they started extending loans by using this money to the developing countries, and they started supplying this money towards to the developing countries. So the developing countries were in need of lots and lots of money because they were like kind of trying to overcome this traditional agricultural setup, and they were moving gradually from the agricultural setup. They were in this transition process of switching over from the primary production and the agricultural sectors dominated kind of an economy towards the manufacturing sector's development, or the industrialization was taking place at that time. So they started borrowing these dollars, which are now known as the petrodollars, because originally they were generated by buying the oil or the petroleum products from the OPEC countries, and this dollar was originally like generated from the US and the European countries and sent back to the OPEC countries, which managed to save this money in the European and the American banks. So the American and the European banks started extending loans to the developing countries, and this is how they started like making money or making profit, further making profit by extending loans to these countries wherever this need of extensive borrowing was there because of this industrialization process taking place in these countries. So as a consequence, we saw that the euro market developed. Euro market developed where we see that this demand for the US dollar was generated, and the other strong hard currencies was also generated for the sake of borrowing by the developing countries in the form of loans which they needed for certain purposes, and that included not only the industrialization process that started taking place in this time period in the developing nations. It also included that they wanted to have external reserves, or they wanted to have external money or the US dollars in order to overcome the deficits which they experienced because of this severe deficit in the balance of payments also. So together this is how this entire mechanics of the petrodollar recycling can be explained, that eventually they started off from the export and import of the petroleum products, and they ended up in generating or developing the banking sector of the Europe and the American country in order to it gets strengthened, or it became very strong during that time period. And when we look at the overall debt crisis that happened as a consequence of all this, we see that because the way the developing countries were borrowing huge amounts of money from the external banks, whatever potential they were trying to enhance, or whatever production capacity they were trying to expand or build, they fall short of it, and as a consequence they found it hard to repay the amount, and that kept on accumulating, and as a consequence we observed that the debt crisis of 1980s took place. So if we look at the various types of origins that contributed towards the debt crisis, crisis that occurred during this particular time period, we observed that there were these four major factors that contributed strongly towards this occurrence of debt crisis in 1980s. And these four factors include the debt servicing obligations that were there for the developing countries, and since they were unable to enhance their production capacity to such a large level where they could nicely repay the amount of loans which they borrowed for this enhancement of the process of industrialization, and in order to fulfill the gap between the balance of payments. So they failed to properly follow or satisfy the debt servicing obligations. In addition to that, they had to make a lot of debt service payments. That is also another factor that contributed strongly towards this occurrence of or adding severity to the debt crisis that happened in 1980s. And another important factor which has been identified is the oil price shocks. So that also aggravated the situation, because if suppose today you have to pay 100 rupees for a certain amount of oil which you are utilizing for a certain economic activity, and because of the increase in the price, next day instead of just 100 rupees, then you have to pay 150 rupees. So if you multiply it by the volume of activity that is taking place in a country, then it becomes it turns out to be in millions. So that creates a lot of trouble for the developing countries in particular. So this is how we see that all these factors together contributed significantly towards aggravating the situation, and the overall scenario of the developing countries turned out to be really bad, as particularly in the context of the severe deficits which they experienced in the balance of payments. So if we see that what could be the options that were there with the developing countries, so together we say that there were two options with the developing countries in order to overcome this situation. Number one is that either they can reduce their imports and increase their exports. And the second option is that in order to overcome this extensive repayment or debt servicing to service whatever huge amounts of loans they have borrowed earlier, they can go for further borrowing. So if they go for further borrowing, again we can see that the additional borrowing can only be made at further stringent policies, or the conditionalities that are going to be levied, that were levied on them were pretty hard as compared to what conditions were levied on them prior to this particular happening of the debt crisis. So it means that eventually the overall scenario turned out to be very hard and difficult for the developing countries that got trapped in this debt crisis of 1980s. So we then see that there are several attempts that have been made by IMF and other funding agencies that helped the developing nations to overcome this problematic scenario of debt crisis. And the various types of combinations that IMF used and is using even nowadays is a combination of the various macroeconomic stability policies, and then they go for a number of various stabilization policies. So as long as the stabilization policies are concerned, they kind of push the governments of these developing countries, including Pakistan, and we have often experienced that while being like the residents of a developing country, that they impose certain conditions on the governments of these developing countries which owe a large amount of loan to IMF and other donor agencies who off and on give loans for certain purposes to the developing countries. They tell these governments to follow a certain stringent combination of policies under the head of monetary and fiscal policy. So they also tell them to reduce considerably the extent of inflation, and they tell them to cut the budget deficits by reducing the expenditures on several heads that are identified by these donor agencies like IMF. And again, they also tell the governments to enhance the tax rate, and they should try to reduce the extent of tax evasion also. So we see these kinds of steps taking place in Pakistan. So also like that help us in understanding what type of stabilization policies are pushed by IMF. So they also come up with a number of different combinations that can help these governments of developing countries in order to overcome the deficits that are there in the balance of payments. So as long as these different stabilization program or stabilization policies that are advocated or pushed by the IMF are concerned, there are 4 major heads that are identified, and they have been in practice we observe in the context of several developing countries also. And these 4 steps include the liberalization of foreign exchange and imports control. So we see that they always try to enhance this kind of liberalization all across the globe, that there should be more competitiveness as long as the exports are concerned, so that there shouldn't be any subsidies or tariffs or quotas fixed by the governments. And because of this increased competitiveness, enhanced liberalization, more and more trade should take place, and this will encourage the people to be more competitive. So as a consequence, since no trade restrictions will be there if a country is competitive enough in order to produce a certain type of product which is good in quality, and the pricing policy and all the other related factors help those products to get a bigger share or a nice share in the international market. So certainly that country, that particular thing is going to help that country in generating more foreign exchange by having a sizable share in the international market. So in a way that liberalization can contribute towards those countries that turn out to be more competitive, or that turn out to be relatively better in terms of their industrial development. So as a consequence of this, they will be able to help themselves in overcoming these deficits in the balance of payments. So this is one factor that is advocated by IMF when we discuss several, when we see various types of stabilization programs that are being promulgated and stringently followed by IMF. Another important thing which we observe in that comes under this head of stabilization program include the devaluation of official exchange rate. So in some other session, I discussed what are the good things and the bad things associated with overvalued exchange rate, and then we also discussed what is meant by devaluation. So by overvaluation of exchange rate, we say that if in the international market or in the free market, the exchange rate of a certain currency is suppose is given as rupees 20 for $1, but the central bank of suppose Pakistan declares that the official exchange rate is, instead of rupees 20 for $1, is rupees 10 for $1. That means it is overvaluing its currency. So as a result of this overvaluation, what happens that the imports become cheaper and the exports become expensive. So when we import things for the local buyer, it turns out to be relatively cheaper, and this kind of a strategy is followed, particularly when the governments are focusing or trying to implement the import substitution industrialization. So if they are trying to encourage the domestic industrial sector, what they do is they try to overvalue the exchange rate, and as a result of that, the imported material, the raw material or imported machinery turns out to be relatively cheaper for the domestic producer or domestic industrialist, and he is encouraged to set up more and more industry or to develop the industrial sector. So however, the bad thing associated with overvaluation is that the exports become expensive, and if you overall see that if we are talking about a country where the imports are relatively smaller as compared to the exports, then naturally when you will be exporting if the exports turn out to be more expensive, then that is going to affect severely or badly the balance of payment. On the other hand, we say that under the stabilization program, IMF often suggests the governments of certain countries where they experience that they owe a lot of money and they are finding it hard to repay the amount, or debt servicing has become a bigger issue, or the overall whatever earnings are there for a certain country, the amount of loan is extensively becoming larger and larger and larger. So they are finding it difficult to overcome this huge increasing debt. So what they do is then they advise or suggest the government of these developing countries to devalue their currency. So as a result of devaluation, the imports in the local market become expensive and the exports in the international market become cheaper. So when the exports become cheaper because of the devaluation, then certainly it helps that country to reduce the deficit in terms of the balance of payments because the exports turn out to be relatively cheaper in the international market. So the international buyer will find it easier to buy the products of this particular country where devaluation has taken place. So this is how devaluation contributes in helping to reduce the overall deficit in the balance of payment. But what we actually observe in the context of the developing countries is that when devaluation takes place, countries in practical terms, they fail to avail this the good things that are associated with the devaluation, and they fail to reap the benefits that they can make whenever the devaluation takes place. But actually practically we see that no such practical improvements take place, and they do not take advantage of these kinds of situations by managing to take a bigger share of the international market, because devaluation has eventually caused the exports to become cheaper in the international market. So this has practiced very often in Pakistan, but we see that no sizable contribution or no sizable advancement has taken place in terms of making a bigger market share, bigger international market share in terms of the manufactured items. So we see that very significant improvements were not taken, even when at several occasions the devaluation of Pakistani currency took place under the instructions laid down by IMF. So the third thing which we are going to discuss, that comes under the head of stabilization programs that are developed by or pushed by IMF, include the stringent domestic anti-inflation program. So they always suggest the governments of the developing countries to follow stringent policies that can contribute significantly or strongly in order to reduce the inflationary pressures or the inflationary trends in a certain developing country. So they put a check on, they monitor or they keep a watch on how much money is being printed and what is the amount of money which is in circulation. So because we know that supply of money has a direct and positive relationship with the general price level. So if there is a check on the increase in the supply of money, that will certainly help us in keeping a check on the increase in the general price level also. So if supply of money is controlled, the general price level will also be controlled. So what they do is, what IMF under stabilization program does is that it keeps a watch on, it tells the government to keep a watch on following such policies, or to keep a watch on the increase in the supply of money, and it instructs and directs the governments to develop such type of policies through which the supply of money should be controlled in such a way that inflationary pressures can be reduced and can be controlled to a greater extent. The next important thing that comes under the same thing, the stabilization program pushed and instructed by IMF, include opening up of the economy to international commerce. So as we discussed earlier, that it strictly follows the principle of trade liberalization, in which this is advocated that such quotas or trade restrictions should not be imposed by the governments of a certain country that can that can contribute in reducing the overall magnitude of the imported stuff in a certain country. Similarly, they always advocate this concept that more and more participation, a greater participation of the developing countries should be made in the international market, so that they should also benefit, and by overall expansion in the overall production level of a certain country, naturally that will contribute very strongly and significantly in enhancing the employment opportunities, the income level generation, and as a consequence of all these positive activities taking place, by expanding to the international market, more income opportunities will be generated, and there will be higher level of income generation activities, and as a consequence more investment. When people will earn more, they will be able to save more, and as a result of that, more higher level of investments will be incurred and made, and again, when there will be positivity, or the overall economic conditions become viable and suitable for expansion, and expansion actually takes place, that would certainly help in increasing the overall income generating potential of a country, and it will find it easier to repay the borrowed money in an easier way, as compared to if it is not, if whatever situation is prevailing earlier, it is not open to the international market, it has not participated in the international market in terms of extensive exports, or the industrial sector is not developed properly. So then in that kind of a situation, certainly the developing country will find it difficult to generate sufficient amount of money, so that it should be able to cope with the local demand, as well as to repay the loan that has been borrowed previously. So these are the various things that are instructed and indicated by IMF. So as long as the overall stabilization program followed by IMF is concerned, we see that whatever policies and programs are followed, or like the governments are told to follow by IMF, they are considered to be, they are taken up as very unpopular strategies. So all across the globe, particularly when we talk to the people living in the developing countries like Pakistan or any other developing country, so you will always find a negative sentiment towards IMF. People do not like the policies that are developed by IMF, or that are there for which the governments are asked to follow, because the reason is that whatever stabilization program strategies we have discussed earlier, all these four things which we were talking about, they eventually hit more the lower income and the middle income class. So when we say that stringent policy for the control of the inflation is concerned, or they go for they advocate, IMF advocates for the contractionary fiscal policy and monetary policy. So whenever we talk about contractionary fiscal policy in particular, it advocates that the taxes should be enhanced, the tax rate should go up, more diverse type of taxes need to be implemented. So naturally, when the low income category people and the middle income category people are concerned, so they find it already, they are experiencing a number of different types of issues and problems while being in the developing countries. They find it really hard to then give us sufficient amount of their whatever they have generated in the form of taxes, so that gets hard on them. So therefore we see that particularly in the developing countries, although we see that we need to make big amounts of loan repayments, and as a consequence of that huge amount of debts which we owe as the residents of developing countries, the IMF stabilization program is there. So although the reason is there, understandable, but as long as the overall impact of the stabilization program is concerned, the policies are considered to be very unpopular in the developing countries because they hurt the most the lower and the middle income group individuals, and because according to them it is relatively easier for them, for the governments in particular, to squeeze the lower income and the middle income individuals and to levy huge taxes on them, and to try to implement those kinds of programs through which more money can be taken from this particular class. It gets relatively easier for the countries. So another opinion, as long as the less radical observers are concerned, when we look at the various types of strategies that are implemented and followed by IMF, the radical observers believe that whatever IMF is doing over the last so many years, they are not considered to be, by them, they are not considered to be the developmental or anti-developmental strategies. So they take it as a neutral kind of an institution which neither contributes towards the development process nor to the anti-development process. However, if we look from the perspective of the developing country, we always consider IMF as a big monster who is there to cut our throats and put us in difficult things and levy heavy taxes on us, or they are always there in enhancing or increasing the electricity rates and things like that. So because they want more money should be squeezed from the people living in the developing countries, so that whatever loans have been extended to these people, they can be nicely repaid, because they foresee that if these repayments will not be made, they are going to be more harmful for the developing countries in the subsequent time periods. But overall, as long as the working or the stabilization program implemented by IMF is concerned, we have got a diversified kind of experience from both sides, from the developed nations as well as the developing countries. Both have a different kind of an opinion, whatever IMF is working with, or whatever IMF program, stabilization program is concerned about. Thank you.